Alright, I know a lot of people think the Zelda timeline doesn't matter, or that it's always been an afterthought, but I want you to really consider how many of these games directly build off of the events of the others. The first 4 games, released in the 80s and 90s, were all designed with a specific placement relative to the others in mind, as shown by their game manuals, and of course, what actually happens throughout their stories. The backstory for A Link to the Past also served as a loose basis for the next game, Ocarina of Time. While that game did complicate things after Link, the protagonist, created a second branching timeline during the ending, every game after this continued the trend of building on an existing story, outside of a few games in a seemingly unrelated universe created by Capcom. Majora's Mask follows Link on a personal quest after he returns to the era of his childhood at the end of Ocarina of Time, and The Wind Waker shows what happens in the timeline that Link left behind, which is generally referred to as the adult timeline. Along with Twilight Princess, which continues the story in the child timeline and wraps up some loose ends, these were the 4 games specifically directed by the series producer Eiji Aonuma. Several interviews showed that Aonuma put a lot of thought into the continuity, and he once even claimed that there's a master timeline document somewhere that only he and a select few others have access to. If you asked me what I thought this document looked like after the next few games came out, I would have come up with something like this, with the old 2D games being in their own continuity and Capcom's Four Swords universe being in another. But about a month after Skyward Sword's release in 2011, Nintendo cooperated with Dark Horse Comics to publish what is now the closest thing we have to an official timeline, which was included in a book called Hyrule Historia. This was a bit controversial. It fits everything into one continuity by claiming A Link to the Past happens only if the hero from Ocarina of Time fails in his quest to defeat Ganon, the Demon King, and the Four Swords games are made possible with their Ganon being a reincarnation of the original. A lot of people didn't like the fallen hero timeline split, but it's probably the cleanest way to fit everything into the same canon. A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes were then easy enough to fit into the timeline after they came out, but things started to become difficult with Breath of the Wild in 2017. So the events of each timeline are completely incompatible with the others, the easiest way of showing this being how Ganon dies in different ways between them. But Breath of the Wild references games from all 3 branches. At the time, the placement that made the most sense to me was either in the adult timeline, which seemed to have the lowest number of contradictions, or just in a new continuity of its own. But I think the intent was that the player imagines it in whatever timeline they want and just ignores any possible inconsistencies. A bit of a cringe explanation, but that's where we're currently at. So before placing Tears of the Kingdom on this timeline, here's a quick recap of what happens in Breath of the Wild. As far back as the founding of the land of Hyrule, a primal evil known as Calamity Ganon has repeatedly attacked the kingdom, only to be defeated by a warrior with the soul of a hero and a princess with the blood of a goddess. This Calamity Ganon seems to be a reincarnation of the Ganon seen in Ocarina of Time, and this premise has already been set up with the ending of Skyward Sword, where the King of Demons, known as Demise, declares that his hatred will be repeatedly reborn throughout all time. About 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, a highly advanced tribe known as the Sheikah devise a plan to seal away Calamity Ganon with the help of their technology. They created 4 giant mechanical divine beasts to be used by Hyrule's champions, and with the combined strength of the champions, the hero, the princess, and an army of automatons known as Guardians, Ganon was successfully sealed away for the foreseeable future. 10,000 years later, the Princess Zelda is born into the royal family of Hyrule, but a character that's only ever referred to as the Fortune Teller predicts Calamity Ganon's return in the coming years. On top of this, the Queen of Hyrule died for some unexplained reason when Zelda was only 6 years old, leaving her and the king to prepare for the upcoming calamity themselves. Over the next 10 years, the royal family does everything they can to replicate the scenario described from the calamity 10,000 years ago. They chose 4 champions from Hyrule's various domains, which included Revali of the bird-like Rito, Urbosa of the all-female Gerudo, Daruk of the mountain-dwelling Gorons, and Mipha of the aquatic Zora. And through a massive excavation project, they were able to uncover the Guardians and the Divine Beasts buried throughout Hyrule. They also found a warrior worthy of wielding the Master Sword, a sacred blade that has always been used to defeat Calamity Ganon in the past. This warrior was Link, the protagonist of this game and the son of an exceptional royal knight. Now all they needed was for Zelda to awaken the power of the goddess Hylia, which was used by her ancestor to seal away Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago. But when Calamity Ganon returned on Zelda's 17th birthday, she was unable to tap into that power. In addition to this, Ganon anticipated the use of Sheikah technology again, so this time, he focused his power on possessing the Guardians and the Divine Beasts for his own usage. All 4 of the Divine Beast champions are killed, and only after Link is mortally wounded can Zelda awaken her powers, which instantly defeats the Guardians approaching a nearby village. Zelda instructs the remaining members of the Sheikah tribe to place Link in their Shrine of Resurrection, preventing his death while Zelda heads off to face Ganon alone. After 100 years, Link wakes up with no memory of his past. Fortunately, the spirit of the King of Hyrule meets with Link to explain the situation. Using all of her power, Zelda has been able to keep Calamity Ganon partially sealed for the past 100 years within Hyrule Castle, and Link must prepare for a final battle before the seal is broken. After he regains his strength, reacquires the Master Sword, and frees the Divine Beasts from Ganon's control, Link can now finally face off with Calamity Ganon in Hyrule Castle. It temporarily takes the form of various Sheikah technology cobbled together, but after Link dismantles this puppet with the help of the Divine Beasts, Ganon now assumes a form of pure malice. But with the help of Zelda, who hasn't aged at all during her time sealed with Ganon, Link is able to defeat this primal evil once and for all. But not really. You see, Breath of the Wild made a lot of money, so while the ending did seem pretty conclusive, there is no way Nintendo wouldn't make a direct sequel to it. In fact, they've already made 2 sequels, Tears of the Kingdom, obviously, and Hyrule Warriors: Age of Calamity, developed by Koei Tecmo back in 2020. Much like many other games in the Zelda series, Age of Calamity was all about time travel and alternate histories. So while Nintendo did oversee its development like they did for the games made by Capcom, it's mostly contained within its own timeline where the Great Calamity from 100 years ago was prevented. Though there's still some neat foreshadowing for stuff that would happen later on. Okay, sorry it took this long, but let's now finally try to place Tears of the Kingdom on this timeline. As far as I know, we're never given an exact number of years after Breath of the Wild this is, but I still think we can get a decently accurate guess when looking at certain details. While Link looks pretty similar to how he did in the last title, a few characters did have their designs changed to reflect the passage of time. Purah, a scientist from the Sheikah tribe, is the most notable of these, changing from what's described as the appearance of a 6-year-old to what she looks like in Age of Calamity, where she's about 24 years old. While this might make you think that 18 years have passed, a secret diary of hers explains that this is only because Purah used Sheikah technology to age herself up again. Another thing that might throw us off is that a lot of the less important child characters seem to have not aged at all since Breath of the Wild. While I don't think this fact should be completely ignored, this is still probably just a development constraint, since some dialogue does confirm that a few years have passed at the very least. I think the character that gives the most guidance for the timeline is Madison, the Gerudo child of Ronson and Hudson. In the last game, there was actually a side quest where you introduced her parents to each other, so obviously Madison wasn't born at that time. In Tears of the Kingdom, she's decently competent at speaking both the Common and Gerudo language, so I think she'd be 3 or 4 years old at the very least. With all of this in mind, my guess is this game takes place around 4 or 5 years after Breath of the Wild, making Link and Zelda around 21 or 22 years old if you ignore the 100 years they were both effectively in stasis for. Now, here's where I'm going to start talking about some mild spoilers for Tears of the Kingdom, but I'll keep that limited to anything you find out within the first few hours of the game. So, much like Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword, this game's story is split between 2 points in time. One in the present, where the actual gameplay takes place, and another way back around the time of Hyrule's founding, where Zelda somehow gets transported to after being attacked by a mysterious, corpse-like figure underneath Hyrule Castle. This time is probably tens of thousands of years before the earliest described appearance of Calamity Ganon, though still after any of the previous Zelda games for a number of reasons, with this Rito character being the easiest piece of evidence to support this, as the Rito presumably evolved to look like this after the events of all previous titles. So the general timeline premise isn't too bad, but there's just one thing that makes it so much worse. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of Amiibo. Official merchandise is cool and all, but when significant amounts of marketing and dev time are dedicated to content that's only available through these little figures, it can get a little frustrating. When Breath of the Wild came out for the Wii U, Nintendo was pushing these little things everywhere they could. So, of course, Breath of the Wild was given a ton of content that was only available through Amiibo. Exclusive weapons, armor, and even a companion in the form of Wolf Link from Twilight Princess. With this content being taken from all three conflicting timelines, this seems like it would break the continuity, but Wolf Link is described as a visitor from another plane of existence, so I guess we can say all Amiibo content is just non-canon multiverse stuff. The same cannot be said for these items in Tears of the Kingdom. Amiibo functionality is still included, but most items designed for it can now be found scattered throughout the world. Certain helmets, like Majora's Mask and Ravio's hood, can be found in the depths. Pieces of armor, like the Island Lobster shirt and the Phantom set, can be found in the Overworld, and weapons like the Dusk Claymore and the Big Goron sword are given as quest rewards. So this already goes against any timeline interpretation that doesn't include some kind of universal convergence, but there's one item that shouldn't exist even with that assumption: the White Sword of the Sky, which... why do they have to put that in? Many fans will recognize this weapon from Skyward Sword, where it was known as the Goddess Sword. The problem is that this sword turns into the Master Sword by the end of that game, which isn't something that Nintendo just forgot about. So one of three things could be happening here. 1. This is an entirely new Goddess Sword, though that seems unlikely since its description implies that it was once used by a hero from the sky. 2. This is the same Goddess Sword brought in from another plane of existence, which does sound a bit far-fetched, but that interpretation would help fit many other items into the story. Or 3. The game's scale is so large that the timeline's integrity had to be sacrificed for marketing and content padding. I'm not a huge fan of that last one, but with the change of director and shift in design priorities, it's definitely a possibility worth considering. So yeah, this is the basic order of events shown in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which you could go into more detail by including stuff like when the mysterious Zonai tribe could have died out, but I think this is enough to cover the basics, and it's hard for me to go any deeper without including any major spoilers. As for how these games fit into the larger timeline, Tears of the Kingdom has only made the issue worse, and honestly, I don't even feel comfortable putting Breath of the Wild into the adult timeline anymore. I'm not going to claim to have all the answers, so if you have any sort of clever way to piece together the timeline, then feel free to share it in the comments. But for now, I need to get back to committing unspeakable crimes against the Koroks. Trust me, they deserve it.